The focus today is going to be on narrative and storytelling exclusively in the area of attempts to try and influence decisions of government. So both politician and public servant, that is our focus. It's related to all the other parts of narrative and communication strategy, but we're not going to deal with those. We're going to try and have this laser focus. My objective today is to have you leave here with at least 3 or 4 ideas on your organization or movement's narrative and how it can be helpful in advancing an issue. I'm going to ask each of you to at least introduce yourselves with an elevator message to your colleagues at the table in just a moment. But as Peter suggested, my experience primarily is in advocacy in the, I would say, corporate, institutional, and other settings of working for large organizations. If I had one specialty, especially during my years with the law firm, it was actually working for other governments that were trying to influence decisions of other governments, plus a lot of nonprofit work that I've done over the years. So that's the background that I come to with this. Here's what I'm going to try and do today. We're going to talk just for a few moments about goals and objectives of this particular session. Then I'm going to turn it back to you. As much as possible, I'm going to try and get you to start to play with some of these things and to work with some of these ideas. Sorry, I won't move around so much. Then we're going to talk a little bit. There's going to be a core part that is largely me talking, but I invite your reaction to it. We're going to talk a little bit about the strategic consideration of narrative, how and why it is important. I think it's going to be cooler if we leave that door open, don't you think? What do you think? Hey, why don't you leave it open, because it's going to be pretty warm in here. Then we're going to go back in a second session, and I'm going to ask you to use the template that you have there in front of you to do a briefing note. As I'll explain earlier, briefing notes are oftentimes one of the most central ingredients in effective advocacy. I'm finding it's damn near impossible to do anything with government unless you give them a briefing note first. And then we'll leave some time at the end to talk about some general issues. But first, some goals and objectives of this session. Again, laser focus on narrative and storytelling as it relates to influencing decisions of government. I'm not going to drill down very deep on any one of these things. It's a very condensed program we have here. There are some other things that hopefully you'll be hearing about in the next little while, more detailed and more focused elements of advocacy technique and practice and strategy, and you'll be hearing about that in the next couple of months. But just a couple of definitions. When I'm talking about advocacy, underneath that rubric, let's include lobbying, government relations work, public affairs. There's several different ways you can talk about it. I'm primarily talking about public policy advocacy, trying to influence decisions of government. And by public policy, I mean all decisions of government. Grants, legislation, regulations, procurement matters. By narrative, again, I mean all-inclusively the process and the substance of communicating ideas for a particular purpose, and in this case, influencing decisions of government. One thing I'm not going to talk about very much is strategic communications, which is a broader template, involves dealing with the media and other shareholders. So that's the approach that I plan on taking here. Does that meet the objectives and what you think you're here to discuss today? Mm-hmm. Getting a lot of nods there. Good, that's good. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. There is something called an elevator message. Does anyone here not know what I mean by that? I shouldn't ask the question so negatively. It's embarrassing to put that question. An elevator message is, simply put, something you say very quickly and very precisely in a very limited period of time to catch someone's imagination. The term comes from the notion that you're on an elevator with somebody, the person you've been trying to see for a long time, and you have all 20 or 30 seconds to capture their attention and move the issue forward. That's the idea of an elevator message. In Hollywood, does anyone know what it's called in Hollywood? Pitch. A pitch, exactly. How's that? How do you envision the pitch?
It must be like 2 sentences.
It's very, very tight, and usually it's some young director or some young writer walks into a Hollywood producer, and he's got 30 seconds to give him a sense of this picture project, so he's going to get the go-ahead on it. There's a movie called The Pitch.
It's Canadian.
I'm not paying this woman, but I will in the future. Actually, that's not the movie I'm thinking of. But the idea is to be able to be effective enough in catching their attention that you encompass many of the key elements of your story, your narrative, your movie idea very, very briefly. So in a sense, it's what's your project, what's your point? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to reflect on the elevator message you have if you have the opportunity for well less than a minute to get, maybe it's the Premier of Ontario, maybe it's the Minister of the Environment, maybe it's the Mayor of your community, maybe it's a senior federal bureaucrat. I want you to imagine who is one of the most important people you will run into on your issue. And you've got 20 seconds to tell them who you are and what it is you're trying to do. Now, what I want you to do is craft that. You can use the flip side of any one of those pieces of paper that we've given you to take notes if you don't have a notebook. I want you to think about that just for a couple of minutes. And then I want you to take turns around your table, introducing yourself and the issue, imagining that among your colleagues at the table is that person that you want to speak to. I'm then going to ask each table to pick the person who gave the best one, and they're going to get up and give it to the rest of them, and then we're all going to critique them. It's going to be so much fun. Okay? So here's the notion. What's your project? What's your point? It can be to a key decision maker. If you can't envisage that, maybe you say it's a friend who I haven't seen for 10 or 15 years, and they're saying, hey, what's up? What you doing? So let's make it brief. And think about it, 20 seconds. Starting, well, now. Okay?
I'm Peter Paul. I'm the project leader of Allies. Our project is about helping skilled immigrants find work, and we work with communities to break down some of the barriers that skilled immigrants are facing every day. This is a matter of prosperity for our Canadian cities. Every year, the Conference Board of Canada comes out with a report, and they, in a recent report, estimated that our Canadian cities are losing between $3.6 to $5 billion every year. That's billion with a B. So this is important, it's serious, and we're meeting with some successes, and we'd like your support to take this forward.
Why did you like it as a state?
I like the cost of not addressing it. That was very well put.
Good. Anybody else?
The indication that there is success, they are having success, but there's a need to build that momentum.
Great. Any other comments on listening to that? Positive, negative? Nobody? Great.
I like the way, after the details, it smoothly moved into the ask. It didn't seem too conspicuous.
Good. Very good. Yes, ma'am.
I would say it would be great if the MPOP would be strengthened by a more specific ask.
That's a good point. Anybody else? Great. Who's the delegate here? Perfect.
I'm in the elevator by David Kaplan, the Minister of Health.
Okay, we're going to have to do that. We've got some competition next door, so let's boost up the volume here. And the energy level. Okay.
Hi, my name is Avanti Goddard. My mother's 90 years old. She lives at home, and she's on the waiting list for long-term care and absolutely hates it. With the right programs and support in her community and in her home, she can remain in her home. What would it cost? It would cost the system $60 a day for her to be in her home, $145 a day if she went to long-term care, and she would certainly have a better quality of life. How can we shift health care dollars from institutional care to community care?
Very good. Now, can we have some of the cheerleading section here saying why they like that?
The personal story.
Specific figures? Yeah, very helpful. Good comparison.
Their accent.
Yeah. Very clear. Anybody else?
There's
Comments?
also personal story that she
painted the picture.
You should spoke about the financial benefit as well as the community benefit in a very succinct way.
Very good. Anybody else? Sure. Yes, Priscilla, please.
All right.
Oh, poor baby, after what you've gone through.
I know. Minister Kenny, I've been wanting to meet with the Minister for Citizenship and Immigration for such a long time. I want to talk to you about how young lesbian, gay, bi, and trans newcomers are systemically discriminated against on every level. After facing so much in their home countries, they come to a safe place like Canada, and they are greeted with so many challenges. And in our program, with the work that we do, I'd really like the opportunity to be able to tell you how we are able to engage them so that they can improve their own lives and become really active, engaged citizens in Canada. But unfortunately, they're facing challenges with homelessness, healthcare, dental problems, and all kinds of issues which we really cannot face without you helping us and being on board. What was that my microphone?
Why did you like that one in particular?
Very enthusiastic about it.
What to be said for that? The sheer physical energy you put into your messaging, too. Good point.
Oh, that's making me nervous now. Okay, so I'm in the elevator with Deb Matthews, the Minister of Children and Youth Services. Minister Matthews, my name is Jessica Weiser. I work at a Scarborough-based adolescent mental health center, and I'm here to speak to you today about the linkages between youth violence and mental health. We have so many young people that come to our center, and they've experienced significant trauma and distress, and what I'm proposing is to develop a partnership with the school boards and have programs in all the 13 priority neighborhoods where young people who have experienced violence can come and get support. I'd also like to propose that we do a comprehensive outcome evaluation of this program to look at how these kinds of initiatives can help our young people. Thank you.
And what's the view at this table? Why did you like that?
Very clear.
Clear.
Touch the right buttons.
Specific
Youth violence priority neighborhoods.
There was a specific project.
She's very convincing. Very passionate. Very convincing.
Anyone have connections?
Okay, any other comments on that? Okay, who's our victim here?
Going to be the presenter. This is to the Premier McGuinty. The scenario is the following. Dear Premier, one of the milestones of your government is to keep and sustaining the quality of the healthcare system in the province of Ontario. And I understand that there has been some shortage of qualified professionals in the field. In the field I work, I support foreign trained professionals in the medical field who wants to get accreditation and licensing into the system and be productive contributors to the province. One question I have for you is what we can do together in order to improve the accessibility of those professionals into the system, in particular to get them into the blah, 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 college. Particular case will be hospitals and residency and stuff like that.
Good. Any comments from this table?
He aligned his goals with the goals of the government, which is very key.
You can leave now. You don't have anything to learn at this session. Okay, any other comments? Well, look, they are 5 or 6 really good examples, I thought, of different types of elevator message. But can you pick out some of the things that were most common and the most compelling ones? Personal story, a particular ask, succinct. Any others? And passion. Even physical energy counted for a lot around here. A lot of people oftentimes when they're giving their pitch are kind of withdrawn and shy about the thing. So the physical energy can mean a lot. Now we're going to come back to that because I'm going to want you to do an elevator message or a briefing note at the end of this session too. Let me just talk a little bit now about the different applications of narrative or strategic considerations. And as Tim Murphy mentioned down there, in part, a key determinant of your message is who you're speaking to. It's going to affect the language, it's going to affect the ask, it's going to affect the other contents in your message. But it's not when you're pitching people in government or trying to get them to do something, it's not always about a particular ask. In fact, the number one objective of many new association presidents is not to go and ask government of something, but rather just to give them background, start to develop a basic relationship. So as important as the ask can be, sometimes it's not the most important. So the different uses of narrative are to inform, sometimes to influence, sometimes it's to motivate and inspire, and sometimes it's the creation of that narrative is an act of leadership with your own organization, to be able to enunciate what it is you're trying to do and to sort of frame the work of the organization. So there are different objectives to one's narrative, and that's a very important function in what it is you actually say. Now, the narrative can take several different forms. We've been talking for the last few minutes about oral narrative, but there are other tools of advocacy and tools that are used in government decision-making that are equally important, or sometimes more important. They can be briefing notes, they can be backgrounders, they can be a backgrounder for people in government, they can be a way of describing an issue in order to attract media attention. Oftentimes, if you heard Tim talk about the notion of framing an issue. Well, same thing for government and in the media. What you want to do is give them an outline of an issue, give them some room to maneuver in that, but to frame the issue in the context that you want to pursue. Now, we could spend days talking about this issue. I'm going to focus on what I call 5 masters of narrative and communication. I'm going to give you just a little bit of information on each of them. There's additional references in the references page on many of the people I'm going to mention here today. The first one is Saul Alinsky. Does anyone know the name Saul Alinsky? You know the name of his book? Rules for Radicals, that's right. To me, one of the best books that's ever been written on community organization and advocacy was written in 1972, shortly before it dropped dead in Chicago. Saul Alinsky was the ultimate community organizer. He started the organization that a young black man by the name of Barack Obama went on to work in Chicago. Saul Alinsky had several theses that were set out in Rules for Radicals, and I've got a reference to his book in the reference page. But the number one issue was, when you want to communicate effectively with people, you communicate within their experience, not yours, within their experience. So to get that, you need to know something about those people. He also goes on to say, if you want to communicate with enemies, you communicate outside their experience and freak them out a little bit. He was the author of the term, the only way the establishment hears is up their rears, not through their ears. But at the same time, he was a man who very much believed in the notion of compromise. It's always better to have half a loaf than no loaf at all. And sometimes you have to take a few crumbs to make up half a loaf. But he's a man who believed in the word compromise, which was a difficult thing to do in Chicago in the 1960s when he was working. Start from where the world is as opposed to where you want it to be, because that is what people can relate to. Some people may have different visions of their future, but it's important to start with the world as it is. He was famous for using humor, and in particularly body humor, for his manifestation of protest, for example. He was the man who, in trying to integrate O'Hare Airport in Chicago, was getting absolutely nowhere working with the experience of the people that he was trying to influence. So it wasn't getting anywhere with the Airport Authority of Chicago. So he filled up a bus full of elderly senior citizens, most of them from the African American community, fed them a lunch and dinner, gave them lots of reading material, drove them up to O'Hare Airport, and they all occupied toilet stalls in the airport. The airport was paralyzed in 20 minutes, and they got to the bargaining table. Because what he had to do was go outside the experience of the managers of the airport in order to grab them by the throat, so to speak. So Saul Alinsky is, especially his communicate with people within their experience, is an important lesson to be learned. The second, someone who probably wouldn't get a lot of votes in this room, is Ronald Reagan. In many respects, one of the most effective communicators in American history. And what are some of the elements of his message? Well, the first is staying on message. They had a very rigorous information and messaging system in the Reagan White House that frankly has been adopted by most governments ever since, and that is to stay on message for a period of time, to not be all over the place and trying to come out with different messages, but to be focused and disciplined. The other thing he did was to his handlers introduced in a much more systematic way the painting of pictures of a story by literally putting that politician in a backdrop. So if he's going to be talking about jobs, he's at a factory. If he's going to be talking about the environment, he's in the mountains. But again, part of the communications message is to reinforce the words with images and words that are sticky. He was also the president who probably inaugurated something that's become a bit of an irritation. When you see a president of the United States give their State of the Union address, they always point to someone up in the audience and start talking about that person's story, whether it's a war vet or an unemployed person. But again, bringing story and something visual to your story. Barbara Jordan. Does anyone know who Barbara Jordan was?
Sure. Wonderful congresswoman from Texas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Barbara Jordan was a big person. And it was her physical presentation, this booming voice, matched up with incredible articulation. She spoke so beautifully. But very much part of her whole message was her own story of growing up poor and, in her last 10 years in Congress, in a wheelchair. She had multiple sclerosis. But someone who brought in her own story and her own physical presence to her advocacy. So, what do you think are the key elements of this man's particular success as a communicator? Anybody? Anybody want to suggest the 2 or 3 things that strike you the most about Barack Obama? Sir.
He's very cool. His body language, everything is very relaxed, no matter whatever the topic is. So people really seem to have responded to that.
I think that's true. Yep. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Inspiring.
Very hopeful. Very much talking about what can be done, not just how miserable things are. I think that's very true. Yes, ma'am.
He's simple in his delivery of message.
I think so. Very clear spoken. Yeah, clear narrative. We have 2 or 3 back there. Yes? Yeah, 40% of Americans can't. But right, that's true. Yes?
And the way he enunciates, he focuses on the words that are more important.
Inflection.
Is anyone in this room, So more about those
That's true, too. Anybody else?
He brings in personal stories.
All the time. Absolutely. And yes, ma'am.
He has 2 phrases that he repeats.
That's true. The audacity of hope. The need for change.
Yes, we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yes.
He has a very good speech writing.
Yes. Who I think is all of 26 years old, by the way. That's true. And one of the other things that makes him, I'm sorry, yes, ma'am.
I think, in addition to all of the things that we said, I think he has a tangible quality, I think, like a star quality.
Yeah.
That he doesn't even need to open his mouth sometimes, but just walking into the room, he has a presence.
Charisma.
Yep.
You want to have lunch with Barack Obama. I don't know about Reagan, but definitely.
Yes.
I heard George Clooney tell a story once about being in a room with Barack Obama. Being in a room with a bunch of famous people, Hollywood stars, well-known politicians, etc. And this was before he was, I think, even a candidate. But anyway, he walked into the room, and I think it was mostly men, and everybody turned and looked at him. And he hadn't said anything. It was just his, something about him.
It helps to be 6'2", impossibly handsome, and have $1 million smile, none of which I can relate to. But anyway, there's another reason that he's been particularly effective, and that is he's partly been influenced by this man, Marshall Gans. Now, in your references, there's two things I have on Marshall Gans: a written summary of his approach to communications, and in particular, a video from the NDP convention last summer, in which he spoke about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but I want you to reflect on it and perhaps get online and see that reference, because one of the things it talks about is building the story. And the building starts, your story, starts with your own story. Now, has anyone here campaigned for a political party door to door? A number of people. And what do they tell you about canvassing door to door?
What do you mean? Who tells you?
Well, all the political parties say the same thing. Don't get into a long debate about policy at the door. All we want to do in canvassing is identify the vote. That's the whole thing. Find out whether they're likely to vote Liberal, NDP, or Conservative. Mark it down on your form, because that's the building block of political organization. Know where your vote is so you can get them out on election day. Gans says, to hell with that. We're going to have people going door to door. We're not going to miss the opportunity. So we want our canvassers to talk about their story and why they're canvassing for Barack Obama. Trying to draw, that's the story of self. Try to draw out other people's story. What are they interested in this election campaign? What are the things that mean the most to them? And combining that story of us and the story of self gets you to the story of now, or he calls it the urgency of now. What are the things that we have in common around which we can build a narrative? I'm not doing justice to that, and I invite you to look at that reference. Marshall McLuhan, who regrettably is the only Canadian we have on this list, talked about a couple of other things we should be reflecting on in our communications as well. One is that where the medium through which you're actually communicating, this is the medium as the message argument, is very important. That there are some messages that suit very well interpersonal contact. There's others that suit very well television. And understanding some of those nuances can be different. And also realizing the effect of certain types of stories on people. Good example of it is here in metropolitan Toronto. The number of stories you see, especially in some newspapers and on some television, about crime. It gives people, in some sense, a totally inaccurate sense of the nature and the incidence of crime. But the one I'm going to talk a little bit more about, because I think it gives us some clues, some hints, and feeds our imagination. I mean, we didn't need to open that door if you could. I think it'll give us a bit more air in here. Sorry, it's so warm. Is Robert Cialdini. Now, again, I put references. If you just Google Robert Cialdini, you'll get a better summary on his discussions than you're going to get from me today. But he is someone who has examined the principles of influence and persuasion as social psychology. Now, his particular focus is on marketing and sales, product. And I'm trying to turn it around and say those same principles are relevant to advocacy, to issues advocacy. I'm not going to go through each one of those. You can read them yourselves in the slide. But here's the key point, that there are really about 6 or 7 different principles that you should have at the back of your mind when you're trying to think of your communications. Now, those there are written in the context of marketing and sales. What I've done in that slide called persuasion in advocacy is apply that principle to issues advocacy. So the first one, reciprocation, in his private sector marketing model, he talks about the principle of reciprocation and influence being something simple like a salesperson giving his customers a bottle of wine at Christmas. It's sort of the beginning of a reciprocity. Hopefully, if I'm nice to them and give them things, they're going to reciprocate and buy my product. You can't really do that when you're lobbying. Or you can, but either you or the recipient could go to jail over it. But there's other types of favors that you can provide, and that's building a relationship and giving them things of value. Yes? Exactly. Absolutely. Or even more simply put, one of the rarest things in any capital is a thank you note. You know, hardly ever happens. For all the times we petition government, how many times do we ever think about thanking them? Oh, God, they're going to make it look like we're pro-conservative if we do that. Commitment and consistency. The notion of commitment and consistency in marketing terms is if we can get them to buy a little bit, we can probably get them to buy a lot. That's what a lot of brand loyalty is about. Well, similarly in advocacy, there is the question of getting commitment and consistency by getting people in government to engage and commit on something modest, because once you've got them committing to it, once they start to see some value in it, they probably have more of a stake in it in terms of where you go next. The third, social proof. Show them what others like them believe or are doing. Now that's, in marketing terms, that's often, dentists suggest you use a certain types of toothpaste. 88% of dentists support it. Well, in government terms, there's a parallel to that. If you can, as part of your narrative, be explaining to government that the proposition you have is actually something that they're using in 6 other provinces or 15 other countries, that helps to relax people when you're asking them to do something that they may not be otherwise inclined to do. Related in part to the authority notion of having someone who is an expert or someone who is known as being impartial subscribing to your particular proposition. Both of those are very important because all of us, particularly if we're dealing on social justice issues or economic justice issues, have a tendency to try and just use the moral argument. It's the right thing to do. You know what? It ain't enough. Oftentimes what you need to do is be able to cite authorities and cite precedents. That too needs to be part of your narrative. The scarcity one, I have a tough time doing a parallel for that. But in scarcity in marketing terms is get it now, there's only 20 left, or for a limited time only 40% off, right? In public policy terms, that can often be, here's an opportunity for you, Minister, to do something that no other politician has done. A unique opportunity to do something different. And the last one is like, well, in marketing terms, salespeople usually are pretty affable. In advocacy terms, somehow we've come to believe that being angry and aggressive is a better idea. I don't think so. That what this means is the attempt to be civil at all times and to be respectful at all times. Though I do suggest another strategic approach called the good cop, bad cop, but we're not going there that today. Yes, sir.
On the scarcity one, though, couldn't you relate that to if they're not ahead on this issue, they can lose votes?
Yes. Yeah.
Or the other party's going to have it?
Yes, though, it's become, in my 30-some-odd years in advocacy, one thing that's happened much more in the last several years than has happened before, and that is the use of wedge issues, where sometimes a party goes out and purposely tries to alienate a group in order to build up their support in an area that is sympathetic to that view. Okay, so it's a little trickier than it used to be. Yes?
Community organizations for seniors, and would it be a negative thing to kind of talk to people and say, in 20 years we're going to be in sync boat? Do we want to be in sync? That's basically it.
Yeah.
But how do you say that? How do you say that without?
Well, I mean that's part of painting the picture. That's part of painting the picture. For example, I'm 61 years old. I'm part of that demographic tidal wave that's about to hit. Which is one of the things I do for foundations is trying to get governments interested in family caregiving policies, because governments simply aren't going to be able to handle it all. And that's part of the picture that we try to paint. That's a good example. Yes, ma'am.
She always used to say something like, said, you might not be an older woman now, but you will be one day. You're lucky.
Yes. Good line. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about who we're talking to. I thought the point was made quite well down there yesterday. Your message and your framing depends to a quite considerable extent on who it is you're trying to influence. And in public policy terms, one of those important factors is the narrative that we use, for example, with public servants versus politicians, with a political staffer versus a public servant, with an interest group that you're trying to get join you in your advocacy versus a decision maker. So there is a tendency among a lot of people that they have a communication strategy and their target is the general public. Usually when I see that, I know they don't know what the hell they're talking about, because you have to be much more targeted on this. There are very few tools in which the general public is an appropriate target, and especially if you're dealing with public policy matters. We'll talk in a few minutes about how you identify who some of those priorities are. But you need to know something about your targets if you want to be able to follow Saul Alinsky's advice, which is communicate within the experience of the person that you're trying to influence. And we're going to give you some examples of that in just a couple of minutes about how you can do that. But what you want to try and understand, if you want to be persuasive with someone, again, just think of your own situation and your children or peers. If you want to be influential with them, you need to know something about what motivates them, what they're afraid of, what their priority concerns are. And that's particularly important in government, because what governments are doing, and why we need to sometimes put ourselves in their shoes, being in government means you are at the receiving end of an avalanche of ideas, propositions, requests, proposals, urgent issues that need to be addressed, terrible crises that are about to break. And you need to find a way of breaking through that. And we'll talk in a minute about that. So, in public policy terms, in government terms, who are the different types of targets? Well, most people think the ministers. If we can get in to see the minister, our problem is solved. I hear this all the time. There's a lawyer here in Ottawa, or in Toronto, who used to be a cabinet minister, Ron Atke. He was a minister in Joe Clark's government. He has a great line. He says, getting in to see the minister is usually the last gasp of a losing lobbying campaign. And what he means by that is, unless you've done your spade work earlier, unless you've talked to political staff and talked to the bureaucrats, you are probably wasting this opportunity to make your pitch. Ministerial or exempt staff. Now, I'm talking largely provincial, federal here, but you could make the same argument at the municipal level. They are the people, usually impossibly young, pimply-faced 23-year-olds, who are the minister's policy advisor. But it's important to know that they are gatekeepers. They are people who help the minister frame an issue. That's a very different target than dealing with an elected person. Bureaucrats in departments and central agencies. Again, I can usually tell the people who are quite experienced in their advocacy when they start talking about the people they talk to in government. The name droppers, the carpet bombing name droppers who try to say they were at this reception with a minister or that reception with an MP, I'm immediately suspect of. I think of people like Hugh McKenzie. Is it Hugh McKenzie? No. General McKenzie. Lewis McKenzie, thank you. Who is on TV a lot talking about military matters when Canada's troops are involved. And there was a program he was on not too long ago in which he was talking about what was really happening on the ground in Afghanistan. And the interviewer said, "My gosh, General, you really do have friends in high places." And he said, "Not at all. Everything I know is from my friends in low places." They are the people who are doing the briefing notes for the general, who are doing the synopses. So again, in terms of your target, try not to just think of those top echelon people that you're seeing in ministers on TV, but rather the people who are oftentimes in very complicated government. They're the ones who are providing the analysis, providing the ideas, more for times than not providing the words that that elected person is going to use. And then outside influencers, that can be other lobby groups, other media or organizations. Now, just a few words on language, and again, I'm going to be referring you to some other references here. By this, I mean the very language that you use, the verbs, the nouns, the adjectives, the metaphors. At the same time, you want to be jargon-free. You don't want to be loading people with terms that only you understand. But there are all sorts of rhetorical devices that can be very helpful to do what many of you have heard of Malcolm Gladwell and his book, The Tipping Point, another one reading that's on the book there. He talks about the importance of sticky language. Sticky language. And what he means by sticky language is that they become worm brains. Brainworms, pardon me, brainworms. I got a serious one myself right now. Words, phrases that stick in your mind. And more times than not, they're metaphors or they're alliterations. Now, there is a very helpful website called virtualsalt.com on there and in the reference that gives you lots of examples of that. So I suggest to you, when you're looking for the language, you're not going to find the language yourself there, but what you're going to find is the inspiration and the creative clicks that will help you find some of that language. Okay, so here's the key point that I'm making in terms of things you need to think about. We can't really do much about them today except just reflect on them and perhaps plan to take them further. And that is, how can you learn more about the things that are going to have some traction with the person you are trying to influence? I call that process strategic inquiry. That's a term I've stolen from somebody else. I can't even remember who. They were meaning something else. But strategic inquiry is, how can we relatively simply learn things that are important in our advocacy effort? In particular, the ask. In particular, our framing of what we're asking of government. How can we learn some things that will more likely give us an ask that has a better chance of succeeding than perhaps the one we just dreamed up in our minds? So the notion of strategic inquiry is, I describe it several different ways. You're trying to find out what the government thinks it knows about your issue. And unless you're very unlike most other people, the first thing you're going to find out is they're not thinking about it at all. But what can you learn about that? So there's 4 questions I usually suggest you ask in a strategic inquiry process. And let me just use as an example a federal immigration issue. There's a lot of Maytree stuff that's related to immigration and refugees. I would say, if you're going to go to Minister Kenny with a particular proposition, before you go there, before you start even defining what your ask is going to be, try to understand where the government's head is on that issue, under 3 or 4 issues, and I'll suggest what those 4 are in a minute. But so you make up a list of maybe 5 or 10 or 15, depending how much time you have. I like to try and keep it about 10 or 12 people. So if we're talking about immigration, we're going to try and talk to the minister's policy advisor, some 28-year-old kid probably. You're going to talk to the people in the department, especially those in the policy shop. You can identify, all of this is available online, by the way. You can go in and see who the policy advisors are, who the ADM policy is, and don't get too hung up about whether or not you're going to get through to the ADM. Go down 2 or 3 spots and you're going to find, may take a couple phone calls to get it, the policy analyst who has to write all this stuff up, the person who has to do the briefing note for the minister. And the types of things you want to ask them are, what's the public policy of this issue? What are you guys thinking of in policy terms when you think of reforming the refugee system? What's the politics of this issue? Now, That's a much more complicated question than we're going to be able to deal with here. But by that, I don't mean what the Liberals are saying and what the NDP is saying or any other of the inanities of question period, but the politics of an even small p. Maybe it's interdepartmental. One department thinks that Department of Industry's got a very different view on an issue, and they're fighting with employment and immigration. And then two other quick questions. What advice do you have for me on this issue, and who else do you think we should talk with? I will bet a really good lunch somewhere that if you ask those 4 or 5 questions to 4 or 5 people in government, political staff side and into the bureaucracy, you are going to come up with a different ask than you would have if you had not asked those questions. You're also going to learn some other things. You're going to learn who else you should talk to, what some of the other stakeholders are, and you're going to learn about their particular position on it. These are things that cannot guarantee, but can substantially enhance your ability to get an ask that is more likely. The 5 Ps, by the way, are these. First, what is the principle or purpose? Why is government involved in this, and if so, what's their thinking as to why? The second is positioning. What's the language they use to describe these things? That's a key part, again, in thinking and trying to communicate within someone else's experience. What's the language they use? What are the priorities of that department or that particular part of a department? How are they framing it? Third, process. Now, this can be particularly important in advocacy because governments are big operations. Who in government are the most important people for you to talk to? They're not always necessarily the most senior. What's the time frame that we're operating under? Is what you're asking of government something that has to be done legislatively? Has to go through the legislature? Is it a regulatory matter that doesn't have to go to the legislature, that has to be approved by cabinet? Or is it just a policy thing? Again, not easy to determine all these, but it's worth trying to find out what they are. The fourth is precedent. What I mean by that is, what are the things that government is concerned about with the decision you're asking them to make? I argue that almost every decision made by a government has some sort of precedential dimension to it. It can be, well, if we give it to them, we're going to have to give it to them. If we're going to do this, what's that mean for all the other similar cases? And unless you have some insights as to what those things are, you're missing half of the calculus about that decision. And the last one is politics. What's the politics of the issue? Now, from that, you can get not only dealing with people in government. Public servants sometimes are very reluctant to talk about the politics. So they usually say to me, oh, I can't talk about that at all, but here's 3 things you should know. But you also want to talk to other interest groups. What do they see as the dynamics behind this issue? Now, all of this with a view to trying to understand about where the people you are trying to influence are coming from, and what they're, also how much they actually know about the issue. You may realize that they know nothing about it. So, what we want to do here now is go back to the matter of, where are we here? Back to the elevator message and the briefing note. Now, the briefing note, there's several different reasons you want to have a briefing note. I recommend when people are doing a strategic inquiry process that they prepare a briefing note for the people they're going to be talking to give them some idea of what it is the issue is. I don't know how often you run into it, but especially I run into it all the time, especially when I'm trying to get to see someone senior in government. It can be the 28-year-old policy advisor to a minister, or it can be an ADM or a DG. If they're going to give you any amount of time, they usually want to have some idea ahead of time of what the issue is. So that's one variation of a briefing note. You're not asking them for anything in particular. You may be trying them out on a couple of ideas you have, But really what you want to do is understand those 5 Ps. You want to get some advice from them. In fact, the term, "can I have some of your advice on a matter," is one of the most powerful tools of advocacy. It's listening. I argue in another thing I do that anytime you are meeting with anybody in government, a huge part of your narrative is not what you're saying, it's the questions you are asking and what you gain from those answers. The rough ratio I suggest, I don't want to be hung up on it, is that you should be on receive 60% of the time and on send only about 40% of the time. Because you can always get back to them later with other stuff. If you have an opportunity to talk to somebody in government who knows your issue or who is vital to your issue, that's worth more than almost anything. Because you do have a chance to get back to them afterwards, to be on receive rather than send. So, again, going back to the briefing, this I attribute to an excellent professor of English who teaches at the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, Susan Doyle. And while she'll argue that there's all sorts of variants on this, here's a template on a briefing note that I feel confident you can all find some value in. So I want you to be thinking at your tables now about what the briefing note on your issue is. Now, I leave it up to you. This can be a briefing note as part of a strategic inquiry process in which you are just trying to elicit information, or it may be a briefing note as part of an advocacy effort in which you're actually going there with a proposition. But the challenge here is to frame your issue in several different ways. First, what is the issue? Described in brief, fairly antiseptic terms, I would say. I don't believe briefing notes should necessarily be hardcore sales items. The perfect purpose of a briefing note is that it is written in a way that the public servant or the political staffer you are giving it to like the way it's set out so much they cut and paste. They cut and paste. Because one of the biggest holdups, for instance, in getting in to see an official of government is the paperwork that has to happen before that. And if you can give them paper, if you can give a public servant the paperwork, which they can say, gosh, you know, that defines the issue so well, interesting background, interesting assessment of key considerations, 3 or 4 clear options, and here's the specific one. All I need to do is rewrite this thing or add a few things. I don't have to start from the beginning. Part of my thesis about one of the elements of effective advocacy called do-it-yourself public policy. That one of the things that oftentimes stands in the way of advancing an issue is that no one in government has the time to even think about it. And if you can start that thinking process off by giving them something that they can use, and with modest modification editing, then you're much more. So we have 10 minutes now before this session wraps up. So a couple of questions. First, does anyone have a general question about narrative and advocacy that they want to ask that may be of relevance to others here? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering what role, if any, social media might have in terms of strategies or connecting with influencers and decision makers.
That session is across the hall, isn't it? You know, I'm writing a book on advocacy right now, and I keep on putting off writing the part on social media. I for one think it plays a very important role, but mainly in just implementation. In terms of a strategy, in terms of defining what your ask is, in terms of thinking about your ask in policy terms, I haven't been convinced yet that social media tells us anything about that. That it's a tool afterwards. Sure, please.
Because I was thinking about this when you talked about the 20-somethings you talked about.
Yes.
That might be assisting, you know, that I think those are the kind of tools. I was thinking about when you were talking about the briefing note and the cutting and pasting. I used to work in government, so I used to write briefing notes. We're not using this kind of frame. But so I was trying to think, if I was communicating to, with that particular, with that level in government, somebody who uses, do they strictly only use print still, or would there be value in, when I'm sending them the briefing notes electronically, inserting a video or a clip or something that demonstrates, that illustrates? I know someone here was talking about squeezing kids. Would there be value in incorporating, some video that demonstrates this program or something like that? And would that be the link to that perhaps be something that would be cut in? I don't know. Maybe it seems crazy.
Well, no. As a general proposition, I don't know what to say about that. On a particular situation, it might be helpful. Here's my problem with social media. Is that I think it ends up taking up so much space, money, and oxygen in terms of an organization's advocacy effort that they oftentimes aren't putting emphasis on what I arrogantly is the really important stuff, which is the ask and your understanding of how a government is dealing with an issue. That may be an unfair criticism. The second thing I will say, and this is largely out of my U.S. experience, the more you have, quote, success on social media, in a sense, I think the more it it sort of debases the broad applicability of it. And here's why. We all talk about grassroots movements and how grassroots advocacy is an important way to convince government. And I believe that is true, except that so often grassroots look like AstroTurf. There's a term called AstroTurf lobbying, and it's lobbying that is made to look like it's a grassroots feeling. So when you're on the receiving end in government, and again, forget the social media, go back 10 years when grassroots advocacy was letter-writing campaigns. And I've been involved in many of them for some good and bad causes. But you have some organizations, for example, one of the best is the hundreds of thousands of letters that the tobacco industry can generate focused on politicians about tobacco control. They can crank out enormous numbers of people. It has no particular impact because there's other more powerful public policy arguments. One of the best examples of AstroTurf lobbying that's sinister as hell, and it's happening right now in the United States on health care. It's what they call pull polling. Push and pull polling. Pull polling is basically an advocacy effort that's made to look like it's survey research. The best example of it was 1993. I was working in Washington at the time. Bill Clinton has just been elected President of the United States. His first nominee for Attorney General was a woman by the name of Zoe Baird. Anybody remember Zoe Baird? She was general counsel of the Aetna Insurance Company, very senior woman lawyer, very highly regarded, also a very well-known feminist, corporate feminist. You can put those two together, feminist. And the right wing went crazy when she was nominated. So they said, we are going to stop this nomination. The way the nomination works in the United States, the president puts out a name, and then the hearings are held by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is 15 or 20 senators made up of both parties. What this lobby did was target the 6 or 9 swing voters, like new members of that Senate, and they put on a full court press on those 6, and this is how they did it. The 6, I'm going to use one in particular, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, former mayor of San Francisco, brand newly elected, a little nervous about what her prospects were in the longer term. What they did with her and 5 other members, they concentrated a massive telepersuasion, telephone campaign on them. And how they did it, they assembled a huge database and cross-tabulated phone numbers with subscriptions to magazines, and they picked the most conservative magazines. They cross-cut that with census data and looked in particular at areas that they felt were particularly livid at the notion of Zoe Baird. And they had phone calls go out to them. Made it sound like a survey. I'm phoning from ABC Research. We're doing some questions on President Clinton's choices of cabinet. Are you familiar with his nominee for Attorney General? No, I'm not. Well, her name is Zoe Baird. Do you know anything about Zoe Baird? No, I don't. Well, Zoe Baird is General Counsel of the Aetna Insurance Company. She's a feminist who believes in the following four things. Do you agree with those? I certainly do not. How angry are you at the thought of Zoe Baird being a candidate for Attorney General? Well, yeah, I'm angry. Would you write or call your congressman? You bet I would. Hang on, we'll patch you right through. So what they were able to do on day one, 300 phone calls to Senator Feinstein. On day two, 3,000 phone calls to Senator Feinstein. On day three, the telephone system broke down. Senator Feinstein thinks all of California is up in arms on this. That's AstroTurf lobbying. If you put enough focus and effort into it, you can make almost anything look as if it is of great import to people. And social media has become so sophisticated that unless you can somehow make it sound like it's really spontaneous, it just sounds like another well-organized effort. One of the narrative dimensions of that, I don't want to go too far off narrative, I've gone off the reservation a couple times this afternoon. The narrative thing there, and I go back to the Zoe Baird instance, they were very picky about the information and the words they used to enrage those people to get them to phone. They tested that stuff. What are the 3 or 4 things about Zoe Baird that are likely going to have the most pull? So back to your instance, what are the things that will attract people, allow them to give you their email address, and then what is the language you want them to use when they communicate to government? And this is one of the challenges in advocacy. If you're trying to do some AstroTurf lobbying of your own, how can you get people, induce them to use language that's their own language? Because the problem is the vast majority of stuff that gets sent by direct mail or by email is the same language, word for word, and the people at the other end know someone's organized that. What is more powerful, if there is all sorts of messages, this was the power of the telepersuasion, because when those people got on the phone, they were using their own words about how mad as hell they were. None of it was looking like it was coming from the same person. They're doing this massively, by the way, on healthcare in the United States, and get ready for the next one on the cap-and-trade system, on the environmental stuff. Massively used for that. Greatly confusing and making very, very anxious congressmen. Keep in mind that the Democrats have a 10-seat majority in the Senate and a big majority in the House of Representatives, and they're still losing those votes because they're terrified by what is behind some of these grassroots things. I do suggest you take the words of Pierre Ducasse, though. Anyone know Pierre Ducasse? Pierre Ducasse was a guy who finished second to last at the NDP convention in Ottawa 2 years ago, or several years ago, when Jack Layton was elected leader. And he electrified the convention by using that theme in his speech. Talk about a theory and a theme, the driving narrative. I thought it was one of the best speeches I've ever heard. But I think it's some good advice to us when we think about advocacy, to try some new ideas. Okay, thanks for joining me.